Hello, welcome everyone to MJH Live, the online public program series of New York's Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. My name is Samantha Shokin, Manager of Public Programs, and I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's special presentation and discussion of the new documentary film, Bess Myerson, the One and Only Jewish Miss America. In September 1945, Bess Myerson made history at the most famous beauty pageant in the world. In spite of anonymous phone calls to judges, threats from sponsors, and growing anti-Semitism, the daughter of struggling immigrants from Russia became the first Jewish Miss America. The documentary tells the surprising story of Bess, her parents and sisters, and the Sholem Aleichem housing project that shaped so many Jewish families starting out in the United States. Sorry, that's my cat in the background. It also follows Bess from her improbable entrance in a local pageant through her heartbreak when sponsors withdrew their support and restricted tour stops closed their doors on Jews. As an early supporter of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, we are honored to host this program tonight with our esteemed panelists, in no particular order: Director David Arond, Abe Foxman, who is ADL National Director Emeritus and MJH Board of Trustees Chairman, Brian Levin, who is Director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at Cal State Bernardino, and actress and screenwriter Barra Grant, who is Bess's daughter, and also our moderator for today, who I will introduce in just a moment, Cindy Graff Cohen. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that tonight's program is being recorded and will be available for viewing later this week on YouTube. The film is also available online for viewing temporarily, if I'm not mistaken, and I'll send out a link to both of those in my follow-up email. And finally, there will be time for a brief audience Q&A session at the conclusion of today's program. To participate, please submit your questions and comments into the chat box. And now I'd like to welcome our moderator for tonight, Cindy Graff Cohen, who is joining us from Texas. Cindy is a journalist whose career spans 40 years with newspapers, magazines, and book publishers in Washington, D.C., Boston, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and Castine, Maine. Today she lives in El Paso, where she is culture columnist for a local newspaper, editor of the region's Jewish newspaper, and a busy freelance writer and editor. Tonight, she is here in her role as the publicist for this documentary, The One and Only Jewish Miss America. So without further ado, please welcome Cindy.
Thank you so much, Samantha, and thank you to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, for hosting this special evening. We're thrilled to share this historic moment, this historic anniversary day, with all of you. So we're going to take a little walk back in time. And for just a moment, imagine that it is September 8th, 1945, 75 years ago tonight. And imagine that your whole family is sitting around the living room listening to the 1945 Miss America broadcast from that big gargantuan RCA family radio. And for the first time, as you're listening, since the Miss America pageant was launched, actually also 99 years ago tonight, in 1921, on September 8th, just imagine for the first time a young Jewish woman has a chance to take the crown. And imagine how you would have felt when the judges give the title to Bess Myerson, the beauty queen from the Bronx.
Sorry, bear with me while I share my screen.
Oh, okay.
We're gonna just play a short clip from the movie, just a moment.
There she is, Miss America. The dream of a million girls who are more than pretty can come true in Atlantic City, for she may turn out to be the queen of femininity. There she is, Miss America.
I love that song.
Isn't it great? It's just beautiful. That was Burt Parks singing, and he wasn't her MC. He didn't start being the MC of Miss America until 1955, 10 years later. But just to celebrate Bess Myerson, I kind of feel like she's here in spirit with us. And what turned out to be an all too rare equal opportunity landmark in those days, we have for our panel discussion, as Samantha mentioned, some of the outstanding individuals involved with this film. So let's start with the filmmaker David Arond of Tucson. He started his career in film as a sound effects editor in Hollywood, and then he moved on to creating documentaries for PBS, including Houseboat Philosopher, On the Internet series, Those Who Came Before, and the MacArthur Foundation award-winning documentary called Mother of the Year. He has a long career in international broadcast journalism and TV and media production in Europe, Central Asia, Australia, and Latin America. In the 1990s, he was bureau chief in Moscow for the PBS Nightly Business Report and Worldwide Television News in London. The grandson of Jewish immigrants who escaped pogroms in Russia, David was drawn to Bess Myerson's story. Next, we have Barra Grant, Bess Myerson's only child, who has been a wonderful resource for this film. An actress, director, and screenwriter, she was in New York last winter performing in her off-Broadway one-woman show entitled Miss America's Ugly Daughter. I saw it in February, and it was wonderful. It was beautiful, and Barra is such a gifted storyteller. Her acting career first took her to London, where her first role was in a BBC series, and then to Hollywood for numerous roles in film and television before moving to writing and directing. You know, I recently saw one of Barra's movies on Amazon, and I recommend it. It was a comedy called Love Hurts, very funny, on Amazon. Barra was married to the well-known producer Brian Riley until his death in 2011. Today, she lives in Santa Monica, where her daughter, Samantha Riley, is an artist. And I have to say, Barra is one of the few people I know who used her pandemic isolation time well. She's working on a new novel. So kudos for that. And next, we have Abraham Foxman, who really needs no introduction for many of you. As National Director of the Anti-Defamation League for 27 years, he's one of our country's longest serving and highest profile Jewish organizational leaders. Abe was born in Poland during the war and raised by a Catholic nanny after the Germans ordered his parents to a Jewish ghetto. Fortunately, the family was reunited, and in 1950, they moved to New York City. Abe graduated from the Yeshiva of Flatbush in Brooklyn, and later from City College and NYU Law School. Abe continues to work for Jewish causes, and in fact, he's been a longtime supporter and serves as a vice president on the board of the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And we have Brian Levin. Brian lives in California now, but he also has a New York City background. In the 1980s, he was an NYPD officer in Harlem and Washington Heights. Today, he is an international authority on hate crime and terrorism and the director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University in San Bernardino, where he also is a criminal justice professor. And some recent news, he is the recipient of the 2020 Wang Family Excellence Award for Outstanding Scholarship, and that's across the entire California State University system. So congratulations on that award. A graduate of Stanford Law School, he's been a civil rights attorney, and he, for a while, worked at the Southern Poverty Law Center's Klan Watch Militia Task Force in Montgomery, Alabama. A prolific writer, he is often called upon to testify on hate crimes and domestic terrorism before Congress, state and federal agencies, and policy fora. So we're going to just jump right in, and we'll start with David, the director and producer. You know, what inspired you to create a documentary on Bess Myerson becoming Miss America in 1945?
Two things. I think it was reaffirmed that the Jews had a place in America, and that was iconic that she won Miss America. But what really inspired me about Bess Myerson was, even though she won the crown, she began her pageant tour only to see it literally taken away. Ford Motor Company didn't give her her car. Catalina Swimwear withdrew the $5,000 scholarship. She was really shortchanged. And what was so inspiring for me was here, instead of just going, woe is me, a 22-year-old woman turned it around and made it a tour against intolerance in association with the Anti-Defamation League. So that was my inspiration, that here she was. And I think there's parallels, and we can talk about that later, what's going on with Black Lives Matter and some of the other social justice issues, but that it changed her for the better, and she committed her whole life for social justice and Jewish causes.
Well, and you were also telling me that the fact that your own daughter she was raised in a Jewish household, and she wasn't aware of the levels of anti-Semitism that were going on. So you wanted to reach a younger generation and tell them that it hasn't always been like it is today. Absolutely.
These stories, if we don't repeat them, and we see the resurrection of hate and anti-Semitism. And this is something Abe and Brian could address, since they look at it closely.
True. Barra, I cannot even begin to imagine what it was like living with a mother who was a former Miss America. My own mother's closest brush with celebrity was when the Cedar Rapids Gazette interviewed her and included 3 recipes in the newspaper. It's beyond my comprehension. So, Barra, what was it like living with a cultural icon? How did her title affect you when you were growing up?
I didn't understand what it was like to be Miss America. The thing I knew was that my mother was so beautiful. She was an incredible beauty, statuesque, really gorgeous face. And there I was, a pudgy little kid who wasn't very graceful, wasn't very beautiful. And mostly my experience was one of looking up to her, because she was 5'10" and I was not. And being in awe of her beauty. Also, I did understand that she was famous because she did host television shows, quiz shows, and we would exit the back door and crowds would converge and ask for her autograph. And I thought, wow, famous, that's something to want to be. I never achieved that level in my own life, but she was awesome. She was an awesome woman, and she was also, let's not forget, really smart. So I always had my book, my nose in a book, trying to, create a very impressive vocabulary. I wanted to win her approval the whole time I was growing up, because she was larger than life. And I thought, if I had someone larger than life confirming my existence must be pretty important. That's what it was like.
Oh my, it was a very unique experience. Abe, you also knew Bess Myerson. What was she like? What's one of your favorite memories about Bess?
Well, she was beautiful, smart, articulate, passionate. I knew her in her caring about Jews, her pride about being Jewish, pride about Israel. So my years with her were all related to her acting out, being able to give leadership, to give voice, and to stand up. I guess there isn't one, but there are two things that continue to pop up, and that is a phone call from Bess would always be, "Hey, did you hear about this? What are you doing? What are we going to do about this?" And that was several times a week. And the most beautiful thing to watch was when she met with young Jewish kids, college students, high school students. That was a passion of hers. And she devoted a lot of time to trying to be a role model, to inspire them. And to see them, this is Miss America, and that icon for every Jewish girl, especially girls, she wanted to interact with. And I had the good fortune to see a lot of that. And that was very, very special and a wonderful memory.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great. You know, Brian, I think of you as kind of our historian, and so many people under 50, they have very little idea of the widespread anti-Semitism in this country. I mean, in the spheres of business, education, society. Putting on your historian's cap, how would you describe the situations that Jews faced during Bess's growing up years? She was born in 1924 and in those 20s and 30s and 40s. How would you describe how Jews were treated?
Wow, what a great question. And I got to be careful because there are actually history PhDs who work over at ADL. So I got to be careful here. But I think one of the things we have to understand is, you know, during the 1920s, that was when the Supreme Court basically overturned the enforceability of restrictive covenants. And they were replete in real estate deeds, for instance, for homes. There were no federal anti-discrimination laws. And around 1924, in response, in backlash to just significant immigration, the highest volume of immigration we had in our history came during the 1920s, it was cut off, particularly to the countries, well, a lot of countries, but with respect to Jews, to those in Eastern and Southern Europe. So that was one thing. Also, the association of Jews with Russian communism was also used. Jews as some kind of foreign outlier force. And indeed, the Klan hit its zenith in the 1920s. And of course, they were horrid with respect to their racial bigotry. But you know what they did for marketing during the 20s to actually expand to the breadbasket in the Midwest? Indiana was actually the Klan stronghold during its zenith during the 1920s, when 4.5 to 5 million Americans were members.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, at that time, they went after immigrants, and that included Catholics and Jews. So in many ways, the currents that affected Jews also affected others. During the 1930s, Lindbergh, and to this day, there are anti-Semites who blame Jews for the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. But we saw the growth of the silver shirts, which was the American analog to Hitler's brown shirts. So there was an additional rise. Father Coughlin during the 1930s. And when Kristallnacht occurred, he blamed the Jews and it was summarily knocked off the radio in some major markets. But the bottom line is, the beginning of World War II saw a change, a clampdown on some of these extremist groups. And then 1945, the Holocaust, and a change with regard to civil rights, of which Bess Myerson in 1945, but then we saw the military get desegregated later in the decade, baseball, and then finally JFK, a Catholic who ran again for president after Al Smith's unsuccessful try in the 1920s, Vatican II, and the Civil Rights era. So just what an incredible fulcrum of the century that Bess Myerson came of age and celebrity in. You know, when my parents were married in 1954, there were hotels that would not take them for their honeymoon.
Oh gosh, yeah. Think about that. That's not that long ago, really. And thanks for laying out that evolution, that shift.
One last point, because I always make my best points after I hang up with the journalist or documentarian. And that is just to get an idea, you know, and I should have run upstairs and got the, you know, my Journal of Eugenics, you know, at that time. During that time, Jews were knocked out of a lot of the colleges that are considered Jewish ivies today, like Penn, where I went. They restricted Jews. Quotas were put in place in the 19-teens and 20s. And during the 1930s, for instance, some of the polls showed that 60% of Americans had negative views about Jews, whereas more recently, the thermometer was that Jews were among, if not the most highly regarded religious group, although that seems to have changed most recently. Listen to this, about 40% of Americans are neutral on Jews.
That's interesting. Well,
Yeah.
we'll see. We'll look at some of these trends. To go back to you, David, this was a story that was over 70 years old. What were some of the challenges that you faced in recreating the time of the 1930s and 40s and recreating Bess Myerson's story for this documentary?
Two things. One, it's a story that had to be told. Unfortunately, Bess had passed, so we had to recreate a lot of the elements through old photographs, news clips, that type of thing, and that's always not as good as the authentic source, but second best. And it's just a time-consuming matter to do that.
And we had such a feeling of that black and white newsreel kind of, with the narrator having that voice from the 40s. And of course, the music from the 1940s was right on target too. Barra, what has been your own connection to Judaism?
Well, interestingly enough, my mother was a Zionist. My mother went to Israel several times, was rubbing shoulders with Ben Gurion, Golda Meir. She took me when it was the bar mitzvah of the state. And concomitantly, Adolf Eichmann was on trial. And it was an extraordinary time to be in Israel. And she imbued me with the sense of a necessity for a homeland. that was her educative position in my life. I later on found a wonderful Rebbe, a Hasidic guy called Shlomo Schwartz, and I joined a Chabad, and I realized how great it was to be a Jew, that there was a whole spiritual side to it. My mom, I never stopped knowing I was a Jew. That was the center of my mom's existence. Israel Bonds, going to hear her give her speeches, watch her raise more money than anyone else for Israel Bonds. And I was very proud and very moved by everything she said. And I felt that I was part of a tribe that was struggling, that had produced great minds and great souls, and how amazing it was that no one liked us. I grew up with a sense of inequity that was terrible. Now, of course, I grew up in New York, and my whole neighborhood was Jewish. My schools were Jewish. It was similar to my mom when she went to the pageant. She thought the world, she grew up in the Sholem Aleichem apartment complex, and she thought the world was Jewish. And then she went and experienced this virulent anti-Semitism. And I feel if there's ever any way, I want to carry on the torch and keep addressing this issue. It was horrible in 1945, and anti-Semitism is horrible today in 2020. And it didn't go away. It might even be worse. And it's incomprehensible. And I think that there are a lot of Jews who are well-to-do and powerful who don't take up the cause of anti-Semitism, and that kind of befuddles me. But she imbued incredible pride and consciousness of what it means to be Jewish.
I don't know, let me interrupt real quick. Abe, if you could comment a little bit on that with your own perspective coming in and, experiencing life in Poland and the Nazis and what you endured, and then parallels with Bess Myerson.
David, Barra, she succeeded. Barra, she left a beautiful legacy with the way you feel and the way you've acted and the way you've stood up. So aside from everything else,
Thank you.
beautiful, beautiful heritage for her. David, you ask a very, very, very broad question. I would add to Brian before being more specific. It was a time, all these things that Brian spelled out was there, but especially in the social cultural world. That means when you think of it, there were quotas. Quotas was a nice name. Jews were barred from universities. They were barred from clubs. They were barred from professions. If you couldn't get into a certain school, you couldn't be a doctor, you couldn't be a dentist. There's a story recently that Emory apologized to the dentists who were thrown out. There was an anti-Semitic dean of the School of Dentistry of Emory. And in 1 year, he failed all the Jewish dentists. Failed them. They had to go to other schools, etc. And it took 50 years for him to apologize. The banks were Judenrein. Utilities were Judenrein. So, when you think of it, either the judges were ignorant or innocent. For them, in that milieu, in that situation, when America was so deeply anti-Semitic in all its elements, for them to vote for her, knowing she was Jewish, my God, she didn't hide it. She wore it on her sleeve, on her face, everywhere. For them,
I'll not to interrupt, but the head of the pageant wanted Bess to change her name to Beth Merrick. And my mother said to her, wait a minute, if I do that, no one from the Bronx will know I won. That's not my name.
But Barra, she didn't change her name, and they still gave it her, which was the beginning of that little spark of hope that in this America of 1945, so immersed in anti-Semitism and all elements, they did vote for her. Now, what happened later was the ugliness of America came forward. David, again, I'm not answering between Poland and my growing up, just to say I was very, very fortunate. Brian has been fortunate, I believe, in his life, but for me to have survived the Holocaust as a child and to have the privilege to, in my adult life, to fight anti-Semitism, to fight bigotry, which almost destroyed me, while at the same time to try to build bridges of understanding, because my nanny was a Catholic woman who risked her life every single day for 4 years protecting me. So to me, America is a great dream. Yes, and it's still not good, and there's still a lot to be done, but wow, where we've been in 45 to where we are now. And yes, Barra, there is anti-Semitism, but it is a lot different than it was then.
Definitely. So Abe, as we know from the film, and I hope that the people that are on this, watching this panel discussion have seen the movie. If not, go ahead and watch it, because I think a lot of your questions that I'm seeing on the chat line, they're in the documentary. And one of the things you'll see in the documentary is how the ADL stepped in after Bess had been turned away from restricted venues, and the ADL stepped in with an idea. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Abe? And then also, I was just curious, did Bess's relationship with the ADL, how did it continue after her speaking tour was over?
I wasn't there in 45. I wish I were. They had guts, they had vision, and they saw an opportunity. It was a wonderful opportunity, because there she was, a gift to the American Jewish community in that very, very difficult moment. And they understood that if they embraced her and if they they put her on a platform, it can help make a difference. So they were very smart in saying, okay, America doesn't want to give you a tour as Mr. We will. And she traveled the country and she spoke, and she was an American Miss America and a Jewish American Miss America. Now, her relationship, this was the beginning of the relationship with the ADL. She had a career and she had a political career, so she was always careful to put that first, family, etc. But for the rest of her life, and that's where I was privileged to get to know her. For the rest of her life, she was a leader in the ADL. She served on our annual board. She headed up the education committee. But again, going back to youth, she also funded. She raised money and she gave money. She was a very, very important philanthropist in those times to the ADL. She funded programs for college students, journalists to go to Israel. She sponsored contests for Jewish students on anti-Semitism, on Zionism, on Israel. And again, the most exciting thing for her was to meet with young people. Till the last day, Bess Myerson was a committed, devoted supporter and member of the ADL, so that she paid back. But she also believed in what ADL stood for: fighting prejudice, bigotry, racism, and anti-Semitism. And we were her platform, especially after she finished her public life. This became her public life. She spoke, she raised money, she inspired till the last moment.
There's a great story she told me when she won. Finally, they put a crown on her head, and she had to walk down the runway while crowned Miss America. And what she told me is there were a lot of Jews in the audience, because Jewish people in Atlantic City had called other Jews and told them, you have to come. There's a Jewish girl. She might win. But what my mom said is, as she walked down the runway, all the Jews turned away from the runway, turned away from watching her, and embraced one another. And what she realized was she was a symbol. The fact that she won, at that moment, she knew it was symbolic. It was bigger than being a girl from the Bronx who played the piano. She had become a symbol of what was beautiful, a symbol of being a winner. After all the things that had happened in the war, she was an icon. And that, I think, she remembered that her whole life, that moment.
She represented, for those people who she ran into who still had tattoos on their arms, she represented a new sort of American, a Jewish American who succeeded against all odds. And what a legacy she left in that representation.
That was also a time, we now know, Dustin Hoffman tells the story now, that when people would ask him, what are you? And he can get away by saying German. He said he was German. Even Steven Spielberg, in those years when he could hide his identity, they didn't wear it on their sleeve. Bess wore it on her whole, on her image, on her being. And, took a time for people started saying Jewish is beautiful, Italian is beautiful. She was the beginning of Jewish is beautiful, not only in the physical sense, but also in the spiritual sense, in the cultural sense, in the pride sense. And again, it's very difficult, not for me, I'm 80, so I can think back to 45.
You look good.
For our younger generation to understand that there was a time where standing up to say, I am Jewish, was an act of courage, was an act of super pride. And that's what the film reminds us of. The bad time, but also the heroism and the courage that Bess represented at that moment. Because all around her, Jews were hiding their identity.
The sign said, no Jews, no dogs. Those were signs when she went out on the tour in Middle America.
And there was no anti-discrimination law at the time and groups like the ADL, and thank you for your work over many years, Abe. Thank you so much. And in particular with hate crime law, there was none of that. We had to wait till the 60s for that. And remember as well, you know, this was at a time when it was before television had proliferated and celebrity was a little different. But in the finest traditions that we see today, for instance, with athletic figures and entertainment figures taking a stand for the dignity of our Black brothers and sisters. This was done in 1945. The camps had just been liberated, and we didn't even have the biography of Anne Frank until 1952. And remember as well, the ADL itself, and again, I'll say this because my son thinks that everything before he was born, I experienced. But in the decade before she was born, Leo Frank was lynched. So this was such an incredible time. In other words, we really needed someone who was going to break that ceiling. And she did it with aplomb and dignity. And it was a time that can't be created again because she was that pioneer.
Right. Can you imagine? She was 21 years old when she won. She went out into the country, and mothers at veteran hospitals did not want her to enter the hospital and kiss their boys, because she's why their boys didn't have legs or why their boys were maimed. They blamed the Jews for the war. How anti-Semitic is that?
And how ironic and just bad propaganda all around. And it's the oldest hate, anti-Semitism. It's been called the oldest hate. And, you know, let's kind of close here before we move to some of the audience questions. Samantha, do you want to cue up that section that starts the 1945?
Yes, Real quick. I have it queued up right here. Let me just share my screen once again, just a second.
Okay.
When she's doing that, Cindy, there was a couple of questions, people who didn't have the opportunity to see the film. If you look at the invite or go to the museum site, you could actually, through this weekend, you can click and watch it.
That's right. And I'll also send a link to the film in my follow-up email. So no worries if you didn't get a chance to see it yet. Okay, I'm playing this clip. Let me know if you can't see it.
What she wanted.
Lenore Slaughter said, my name was not a good name for show business. And I said, well, you know, I have no intention of going to show business. I said, what do you want me to change it to? Well, you know, there are a lot of good stage names like Beth Merrick. I said, the problem is that I'm Jewish, yes? And with that kind of name, it'll be quite obvious to everyone else that I'm Jewish. And you don't want to have to deal with a Jewish Miss America. And that really was the bottom line. I said, I can't change my name. You have to understand, I cannot change my name. I live in a building with 250 Jewish families, the Shalom Aleichem apartment houses. If I should win, I want everybody to know that I'm the daughter of Louis and Bella Myerson.
Bess won the title Miss New York City. More than this, she won her own self-respect, having stood her ground and retained her identity. Now she had a shot at a $5,000 scholarship and the title of Miss America. Bess returned home a local celebrity.
I'll stop it there.
You know, I might just add, when I got my New Yorker this week, this is yesterday, September 7th, there is a nice article about the history of Miss America. And they cite Bess 3 times in the article, which is nice, and that she was the first and the only Jewish Miss America. But there was one section that they called out especially, and it was about this pivotal moment for Bess Myerson when she made that decision. In 1945, pageant officials pressured Miss New York City, Bess Myerson, to anglicize her name. Myerson refused and won the contest anyway. And I was just thinking, as you're talking about some of the discrimination, you know, people would change their last names. And we all know Jewish people whose names are different than the ones that they came over with because of the tremendous disadvantages that came with anti-Semitism in this country. Well,
now we have the marvelous Mrs. Maisel.
Pardon?
We have one of the most popular shows in America, the marvelous Mrs. Maisel.
Yeah. Yes.
Progress.
But we have had some progress. So as we close with this part of the discussion, I'm going to ask one last question. And this is kind of like the lightning round, just a short answer from each of the panelists. What was, for each of you personally, the most important message or the most important takeaway from the one and only Jewish Miss America documentary? We'll go alphabetical. Abe, what was the most important takeaway?
How one person who cares passionately about justice, equality, anti-Semitism can make a difference. And everything that we now see that we have achieved, Bess Myerson has had a role in. And the film reminds us how much things can change if we care enough.
Perfect. Barra, what's your biggest takeaway?
I think it's her speech that she wrote in 1945 and did for the ADL when they sent her on her tour. The title of the speech was, "You Can't Be Beautiful and Hate." And she meant that. And at the time, that was what the message she had to get across. And I think it still reverberates today.
It was a powerful message then, and it should still be today. Brian, what's your biggest takeaway?
The time and her unique position as a historical symbol of the image of Jewry that had just come from the literal ashes of the Holocaust. You know, it's funny, I was talking to a wonderful reporter, I don't want to embarrass him, recently, and he was writing a wonderful, uplifting article about Holocaust and genealogy. And I said, you know, my dad was a POW in a Nazi prison camp. He was an American soldier. And what I realized in talking to him, and then, you know, others over years, is that generation, everybody suffered. Everybody either watched this from afar, had family members, or someone across that chain with regard to refugees. So the notion of the Talmudic reference to seasonality, there's a season, and she was the woman of the season and showed that showed that others can be beautiful as well, and that goes right into today, where Black is beautiful, and a whole other concept of where beauty, celebrity, and dignity comes from. What an important point. And you know, in some ways, I think she was our first, like, Jackie Kennedy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It was her season, and she was the right person at the right time and handled it all so beautifully. So we'll end with the conceptualizer, the creator of this documentary. And David, I know you must have so many takeaways, but what was your major message that you wanted to convey, the major takeaway that you want to share?
I think the takeaway for me with Bess Myerson is she stood her ground, never again. She was not going to just roll over and let, you know, the ugliness of anti-Semitism prevail. You know, that she was able to speak up as 22 years of age. And I think, you know, we see some of the comments, she's a tremendous inspiration to our youth. And that's why she sponsored the scholarships and dedicated her life to this next generation.
Great. Well, now we're going to be moving on to some questions that Samantha's culled from the many questions coming up. And thank you to the panelists.
Can you guys see and hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. So we have a question here from our viewer, June. When Bess won, was there any discussion about her being Jewish in the media or just like out there? What was the reaction like?
I'll answer this real quick, and then maybe Barra wants to follow up. But I mean, it was obvious. So it's one of those things you didn't have to ask or announce, just by her name, her looks, and what she stood for, and the fact that she came from New York City. And back then, New York City was 1/3 Jewish.
Well, something terrific happened. This is after she had come back halfway from the tour. Fiorello LaGuardia, who is mayor of New York City, opened Carnegie Hall, and under his breath said to Bess, "I don't care what the rest of the country thinks. New York City loves you." And Bess sat down at the piano and played the Grieg Piano Concerto in A minor with the New York Philharmonic. And she was spectacular. And when it was finished, she took her bow, and her mother in the wings whispered to my mother's father, my grandpa, "I don't know how she did that. She never practiced." That doesn't answer your question. I just thought I'd tell you that story.
It's a great story. Anyone else want to comment, or should we take the next question?
On to the next.
I mean, you know, the whole Jewish community, my mother grew up, and her family, they were in Chicago, and, you know, at that moment, everybody was glued to the radio in the living room. Every, you know, Jew across America, I don't think anybody did not know, you know, the pageant was occurring, and Bess Myerson was the likely contender.
One thing that should be mentioned, just in terms of Jews, there was Queen Esther. Queen Esther was a beauty queen, and she saved her people. Other than Queen Esther, Jews did not want their daughters to be beauty queens. They didn't want them parading in bathing suits in front of people. And the very fact that a Jewish girl became Miss America was outrageous for Jews. It was the last thing a Jew would think of what their daughter would be. Maybe a doctor, a lawyer, married to a doctor, a lawyer, but not a beauty queen. And she shattered every, even in the Jewish community, people were amazed that a Jewish girl was crowned Miss America.
Amazing.
She was, one thing real quick, you know, she won not just because she was beautiful, but she was an incredible musician. She went on to Juilliard in Columbia for a graduate school in music. She might have had a whole career in music. This changed her life, and she was extremely smart. So, you know, the beauty was just sort of a side note.
At the pageant, she was the only college graduate that year, and she was the classical pianist and flautist, while most of the girls twirled batons and yodeled. They didn't really have very much talent. And I think the judges voted for her because you couldn't not vote for her. You streamed through the piano concerto, you played Gershwin on the flute, you're 5'10" and you're magnificent. Who are they going to vote for?
And I think the other thing too that's so important is Bess Myerson suddenly was probably one of the first feminists when you think about it.
Right. Back in the day.
I mean, she really inspired not just the Jewish people, but she was an incredible role model for young women.
Yes, I agree. She was very tight with Gloria Steinem and Friedan and those women, and Jackie Onassis. When you look at all her photographs on Wikipedia, she's usually arm in arm with one of those dames.
But she always raised more money than.
David, I just had a strange thought. What if when the movie you filmed, the documentary, really goes public, that we ask these corporations who refused to sponsor her, who are still in business, and the resorts who refused to host her, who are still in business. Wow, wouldn't it be a nice moment if they came together in a public statement with an ad or whatever to apologize for the prejudice that they engaged in at that time? It would be a very, very meaningful
Great idea. They'll never do it, but it's a great idea.
But could I just ask a question? Wasn't she promised a Ford?
Yes.
And the Ford Motor Company, you talk about the history,
Yes.
Henry Ford published the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion and the Dearborn Independent, among the most rabidly racist, anti-Semitic publications in American history. And later, after the war and with the work of Jewish groups like ADL and others, they turned around. But it was a time when the media, the legal establishment, just give you one thing real quickly. I graduated from Stanford Law School, and my professor was Gerald Gunther. And so I was one of his last students, and one of his earlier students was someone named Ruth Bader Ginsburg when she was at Columbia. And when I told Justice Ginsburg that, she was very surprised that I would be even in a constitutional law class. But at that time, the kind of legends that we see now, even that law professor could not get a job, even though when he died, he had the most widely cited article, the most widely used casebook. But when he got out of law school, he could not get a job at any of the New York law firms. Similar to the judge that mentored me, when he got out of Yale, none of the white firms in Philadelphia would take him.
Wow.
Barra, do you want a Ford?
I drive a Ford now. It's okay.
We got to get Barra her Ford.
Yeah.
We have
Mostly, my mother wanted to buy a piano. She wanted to take whatever money she would get from these sponsors. My mom learned the piano on an out-of-tune upright in the living room in the tenement apartment she lived in. She wanted a piano, and there was no money from any of the sponsors for her to buy one. I find that sad.
Yes, that was her whole motivation when she entered when her sister entered her surreptitiously in the Miss New York City pageant. Bess agreed to go into the pageant for the $5,000 scholarship, which she awarded and buy
and a new piano.
Back when $5,000 was $5,000.
Yeah, she didn't get it.
Let's take a few more questions since we are kind of limited on time. So a few questions coming in here about the background of the judges in the contest. Were any of them Jewish? Maybe you could tell us just more about if they had like liberal thinking or a little bit more.
One judge was very interesting. His name was Harry Conover. And Harry Conover ran an elite modeling agency in New York City. And my Aunt Sylvia, my mother's older sister, said to Bess, you can be a model. And she went in to meet Harry Conover. This is way before the pageant. And Harry said to her, Bess, you're a very lovely girl, but you don't have what we need, which is that all-American look. You look a little too, shall I say, different. And there he is at the pageant in the judge's seat, dying not to vote for her, and he had to. That's Harry Conover, big judge at the pageant. That's the only person I know who was a judge. But they were warned not to vote for her with little notes slipped under their door the night before judging, or they would never be invited back to the pageant if they voted for her.
David, do you want to add anything or should I move on?
I just want to encourage everybody to watch the documentary. I think it's a great story and very inspiring.
Absolutely, that goes without saying. And once again, to those who are asking, I will include a link to the film in my follow-up email, and that will be up online through the end of the week. Is that right, David?
Correct.
Great. Okay, so time for just a couple more questions. A couple folks here want to know about what happened, if there were any repercussions with that $5,000 that you mentioned. There's like, people are asking if it was withdrawn, if I understand that correctly. Yeah. Barry,
Yeah, He never got a scholarship.
Mm-hmm. And what happened? What was the aftermath?
Sorry?
What was the aftermath of that?
She was decimated. She didn't get a scholarship. She didn't get money. She got nothing. The thing they wanted her to do was play in vaudeville houses in her bathing suit in front of a lot of men. So she wouldn't do that. And then she never got what she was promised. And that's why the ADL found her when she went back to the Bronx, only halfway through her tour. And that's when the ADL saved her life and said, Bess, forget about it. You've got to pick yourself back up and go out there into the country and reach people who are not yet bigoted. And that's the youth. That's the youth of this country. And that's the great thing the ADL did to make my mother whole again.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Barra. And as a follow-up to that question, there are a few questions coming in about Bess's family life. People would like to know if she was religious at all, if she attended services or had seders, and also if she continued to play piano through the rest of her life.
My mom continued to play, but she was rusty. So she could play the first bars of Beethoven's Ninth, the first bars of Chopin and Mozart. She became another person. She didn't remain a pianist. And my mom was very busy. My mom was giving speeches. She was on television. And we celebrated all the high holidays, but I have to be honest. My mom was a political Jew. My mom wanted Israel to exist more than she wanted to go to temple every day and pray. She was very, I have to tell you, she was secular, but her entire life was consumed with Israel and the Jews having a homeland. She was spiritual, but we didn't grow up running to Temple Emmanuel every day.
Hey, real quick,
I'm sorry.
I think one thing that's interesting, a story Abe shared with me, Bess, I think, saw her role and she was gifted as a catalyst to help raise money and mobilize people. What was it like when she would walk into a fundraiser, Abe, when you saw Bess Myerson?
He was a fantastic attraction because they came not just necessarily to hear her, but to see her, to be able to say, "Oh, I went to see Jewish Miss America." So she was a tremendous attraction. But the surprise was she was articulate, she was smart, she was, she inspired. And so she wasn't just a pianist. She really was a leader. She took her position, her role very seriously. And as Barra is saying, her love of Israel in every speech, she understood what Israel meant to the Jewish people because she understood the history of the Jewish people. And she herself witnessed the height of anti-Semitism in this wonderful country.
Right. And as we know, even in New York, FDR turned the boat away. There was nowhere for Jews to go. And that's why my mom was so committed to the state of Israel, which even today is not secure.
So we have time for just one or two more questions. We try to wrap these up in around an hour, but since the conversation is so interesting, it's okay, I think, if we go a little bit over time. So here's a question from Sarah. Sarah would like to know if Bess had the legal grounds to sue the pageant for the prizes that were withheld from her. Do you know anything about that?
Well, not only, I want to say this very strongly. My mom never blamed the pageant. My mom became the spokeswoman at the pageant for many years. she was a commentator up in the booth with Bob Cummings or whoever her co-host was. She hosted the pageant for years and wound up being grateful. It wasn't the pageant. It was the people, and the sponsors probably weren't at fault because they knew they were speaking on behalf of their customers, and the customers didn't want to see a Jew in a Catalina bathing suit, didn't want a Jew tasting their food in a General Foods ad. My mom never ever exhibited any anger toward the pageant. She was grateful. She was grateful to have been Miss America.
Amazing. And I guess this will be our last question before we start wrapping things up. Question from Debbie. How did Bess's husband and the rest of her family handle her fame?
Wow. I guess I have to answer that, right? My dad was a World War II vet. He had been stationed in the Philippines, and he came back. He saw my mom at an event and decided he would marry Miss America. My mom did not want to go back to the Bronx, so she married my dad. And unfortunately, my dad suffered from his experiences in the war, and my mom had a very hard time in that marriage. My mom was a great woman who picked not so great guys. And that's my family story. I felt that I was raised like the Immaculate Conception. I just had a mother. I didn't have a dad. So that's how my family was.
Incredible.
But thank God you had a wonderful mother.
She was it. She was my mother, my best friend, my father, my uncle, my aunt, my sister. She was everything to me.
Did you ever learn to play the piano?
No, I hated the piano.
Neither. I'm in the music diaspora Jew on this panel.
I couldn't play the piano.
Lovely. So I think we should wrap things up here. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today for this very special program. Once again, the film Bess Myerson, the one and only Jewish Miss America, is available for viewing. I will send out the Vimeo link in my follow-up email. And also it's on the registration page. So if you registered for this program, as I'm sure everyone did, to access the program, in the description, the link is right there to watch the film. So just follow that link. It's not password protected. You could just watch it through the rest of the week. And then we'll take down the link. So make sure to tell your friends about the film. Make sure they go out and see it on Vimeo before we take it down. Once again, thank you so much to Abe, David, Brian, Barra. Oh, and Cindy's holding up the cover there.
It's being shown at a number of Jewish film festivals, including the largest Jewish film festival in the world in Toronto. So we're not selling it online yet, but when you go to the website, www.jewishmissamerica.com, first of the year, you'll be able to buy it. So it's a hard copy video too.
I don't want to say it, but it's already won 27 international awards for excellence in documentary films.
28, because the center is giving it an award as well.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're so grateful to all of you. Thank you once again. And remember that this program was recorded. It will be uploaded to our YouTube channel in the coming days. So look out for my follow-up email with links to all of those. Thank you to all who tuned in.